What if I told you that the absolute truth is that Jesus Christ and Willie Lynch are both fictional characters that are being used to distract us from learning the truth of our plighted condition, the truth that's actually required in order to truly free ourselves? Any belief system that requires for us to shut down our critical thinking abilities in order to hold on to that belief is never the truth that sets us free. Real truth requires that you start critically thinking and looking at all facts. Please, let's do so. How do you know for certain that everything that you currently believe are true when everything that you currently believe came from our brutal oppressors? A fact that has remained consistent throughout history is that brutal oppressors never teaches the truth to the descendants of those they brutalized throughout history. They instead always teaches the descendants of those they brutalized throughout history lies that prevents those descendants from harboring resentment towards the group that has brutalized them throughout history. Lies that prevent the oppressed from seeking retribution against their historical brutalizers. This fact has remained consistent throughout world history, and it is still true now in regards to Black people living under white dominance. The white society has fed lots of lies into the collective minds of the Black masses that keeps us thinking in ways that serves and protects the interests of their white society. I will prove this by first asking you to take a few moments to start really critically thinking for yourselves. Doing so is not a crime yet. Now, ask yourself, if all of your meals were being prepared by a person that was history's most notorious serial food poisoner, naturally, you would be reluctant to blindly accept a meal being prepared by such a person. Logically, you would question, is it possible that your food is currently being poisoned? It would be a legitimate question to ask, given the history of the person who is preparing all of your meals. In fact, doing so would be basic common sense. Likewise, using that same logic, to not now question the validity of all that you currently believe, when everything that you currently believe came from those that have proven themselves as being history's most notoriously deceitful liars, and to not question it is lacking common sense. But the reason why millions of Black people now blindly accept whatever the white society tells us to believe, in spite of their notoriously deceitful history of the contrary, is not because Black people are too forgetful, too forgiving, nor are we suffering from some form of collective amnesia, as many have short-sightedly stated. Nor is it the silly Willie Lynch myth. The true reason why millions of Black people now blindly accept whatever the white society tells us to believe, in spite of the notoriously deceitful history of the contrary, is because Black people have been socialized to do so. Socialized is when the oppressors exploit their monopoly over the information that the oppressed population receives by repetitively feeding false informations into the collective minds of the oppressed that manipulates the oppressed to think and behave in ways that are beneficial to the oppressors. The socializing of the oppressed is possible because regardless of how intelligent people are, if it's possible to control the input of information that people receive, it's entirely possible to control what they'll believe and what they'll think and even how they'll behave. Because people's behaviors aligns with the information that they receive, the white society therefore exploits its monopoly over the information that Black people receive by feeding us false information that socialize us to think and behave in ways that are against our own self-interest and that instead serves and protects the interests of their white society. Case, point, and proof. The history that we've been taught within our white governed schools in regards to the African slave trade intentionally shifts the culpability of the African slave trade more greatly upon Africans than the white enslavers. Excuse me. It does so by miseducating us to believe that most of our enslaved ancestors were sold off by other Africans to the white enslavers. Millions of black people today now repeats this narrative every day. It ties into their false indoctrinated belief that it's ourselves that are our worst enemies. Thus, they're thinking in ways that benefits the white society. But critically think and ask yourself, if Africans originally owned all of the gold, diamonds, minerals, and natural resources, and Western money had no value whatsoever in Africa, how then is it possible that most of the enslaved Africans were sold off and therefore fairly purchased? The belief that most of our enslaved ancestors were fairly purchased is total bullshit, designed to make us think and behave in ways that serves the interests of the white society. Furthermore, critically think again and ask yourself, why wouldn't the greedy white invaders maximize their profit by exploiting their weaponry advantage of rifles, guns, and cannons to kidnap most of their enslaved Africans? Clearly, the history we've been taught about the African slave trade has been whitewashed. Furthermore, it deliberately hides the brutal massacres of countless African warriors that died in battles trying to rescue their captured loved ones from the slave ships. As the African warriors charged the beaches, the ship's crew shot rifles and cannons at them, leaving thousands of blood-soaked black bodies lying upon the beaches. The number of Africans that died in battle fought against the white enslavers far exceeded many times over the numbers of any Africans that may have participated in the slave trade. The hiding of these fierce battles and massacres is deliberately done to perpetuate the lie that most Africans were merely sold away and therefore fairly purchased. To further convey the falsehood that most African slaves were sold away by other Africans, several white artists were hired to create pictures of Africans selling their fellow Africans to the white invaders. Reproduction of those drawings and paintings can still be found within our school textbook today. Therefore, every time that a black student reads about the chapter covering the African slave trade, those pictures are placed between the texts, subliminally conveying the falsehood that most of our enslaved ancestors were sold away by Africans. White propagandists have mentally enslaved millions of black people by feeding us lies that makes us think in ways that serves and protects the interests of their white society. Those black people who do not critically think nor ever questions the validity of all information that they receive from white sources are the ones that becomes mentally enslaved while never noticing their mental change. Here's another false narrative that they've miseducated millions of black people to believe. To make us believe that slavery benefited us, they miseducate us to believe that our ancestors were illiterate and uncivilized before the Europeans invaded Africa and enslaved Africans. This narrative literally makes millions of black people feel grateful and even indebted to the white society for having brutally enslaved our ancestors. But it's actually the opposite of the truth. The hidden reality is that long before the Europeans invaded Africa, It was Africans, when we called ourselves Moors, that civilized Europe. Africans introduced science, math, writing, and philosophy to Europeans. Africans also introduced hygiene practices to Europeans. This includes shaving, the use of toothpaste, perfume, fragrance, oils, deodorants, and even introduced the daily bath to Europeans. Queen Isabella of Spain bragged that she had only bathed twice in her entire lifetime. Queen Elizabeth I claimed that she was the cleanest woman in all of Europe for reportedly bathing once a month. This non-bathing practice among Europeans only stopped after Africans introduced the daily bath to Europeans. These are historical facts that they hide from you. Furthermore, all of Europe's first Greek scholars received their formal education in Africa's ancient Egypt. The Greeks openly admitted that their knowledge originated from Africa. When Socrates wrote of his studies in his book Bucyrus, he said that I studied philosophy and medicine in Africa's Egypt. To conceal the greatness of Africans, the white society conceals the fact that Africa's ancient Egyptians were logically and accordingly Africans. However, all scientific evidence proves that they were in fact Africans. The geographical location of Egypt is in Africa. Radiocarbon date testings have scientifically proven that the ancient kingdom was built by Africans many thousands of years long before the arrival of the first Arabs and the first Europeans, the Greeks, during the 7th century. Hair sample testings, melanin concentrating skin testings, bone density testing, and DNA genetic analysis have all scientifically proven that Africa's ancient Egyptians were in fact Africans. Also, the world's oldest university, library, manuscript, encyclopedia, human prosthetic, mathematical tools, medical journals, and the world's oldest standing kingdom are all located in Africa. Africans are the first to build in stone and to smelt metal. The world's largest wall ever built is not the Great Wall of China. It's actually the Great Wall of Benin, located in ancient Nigeria. The wall was 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China, and it consumes 100 times more material than the Great Pyramid. It's also recognized by the Guinness Book of Records as being the largest earthwork in the world carried out prior to the mechanical era. Africans also introduced science, writing, mathematics, and philosophy to the world. Africans invented the wheel, paper, the calendar, the concept of 24 hours in a day, the 365-day calendar, the clock, leap year, organized labor. Africans invented surgical instruments, cosmetic, the plow, the wheel, black ink, ink pen, shoes, high-heeled shoes, condoms, hair wigs, hair dyes, hair extension, makeup, hairbrush, keys, hair combs, vase, Bretmans, the chisel, door locks. The oldest human prosthetic is found in Africa. Astronomy, medicine, the solar calendar, paved roads. The narrative that our ancestors were illiterate and uncivilized before the Europeans invaded Africa is an absolute lie designed to make us feel that the white society's enslavement of us benefited us. They feed us disinformation to make us think in ways that benefits the white society. The white society sits upon a throne of lies that makes millions of black people think in ways that are against our own self-interest and that instead serves and protects the interests of the white society. This is the truth of our plight and condition. And last but not least, it's also no strange occurrence that millions of black people are now self-loathing, perceives ourselves as being our own worst enemies, and reveres our oppressors in spite of such a brutally horrific history of the contrary. These noted thoughts that exist among many black people that clearly benefits the white society are by deliberate design. They were deliberately, subliminally embedded into the collective minds of millions of Black people through the white society's monopoly over information. The white media's unrelenting negative depiction of Black people that amplifies the negative to the point that it distorts our reality in order to subject us to receiving the fraudulent worst about ourselves is much more than just biased media reporting. It's actually a covert, insidious, demoralized, divide and rule psychological warfare campaign. Demoralize, divide, and rule is a method of maintaining control over a target population through constant and unrelenting demoralization in order to create self-hatred and division between them. It is a well-proven target that has been used for centuries by oppressors to control their oppressed. Because when the oppressed are made self-loathing, they are much more easier to control. This is precisely what has been done to Black people through the white society's monopoly over information. This propaganda campaign is deployed like a massive media marketing campaign that constantly subjects Black people to receiving only the fraudulent worst narratives about ourselves. The fact is, no group can be constantly subjected to receiving only the fraudulent worst about themselves and not suffer some adverse effect. Within this system, fraudulent Black racially demoralizing propaganda is being pumped unrelentingly into the unsuspecting minds of the Black masses without being challenged nor counterbalanced by an equal amount of positive Black racially affirming information. It conveys a subliminal message that Black people are now our worst enemies and that we therefore need whites to govern over our lives. Moreover, that Black people should trust, respect, and admire only whites. This system is extremely effective because when Black people are subjected to these propaganda campaigns so unrelentingly, it can be very difficult to resist its implied propaganda programming, especially when the propaganda is being told daily and so unrelentingly. This is the truth of our plight and condition. It has nothing to do with the silly Willie Lynch myth. We are being controlled through the white society's monopoly over information that we receive. It is time for us to wake up to our reality. Sadly, to our detriment, the oppressed will always believe the fraudulent worst about themselves. That's a quote from Frantz Fanon. Brothers and sisters, it's time to function based on what is true. One love and peace.